Hollywood in the Golden Era was a town built on beautiful illusions and ironclad contracts. It was an immaculate machine that manufactured gods and goddesses, but rarely, if ever, allowed them to be truly human. Among the deep shadows and stark lighting of film noir, one remarkable woman stood out, not just for her captivating, intense performances on screen, but for her absolute unyielding refusal to be just another pretty asset bound by the ruthless dictates of the studio bosses. Her name was Ida Lupino. You remember her, don't you? That piercing, intelligent gaze. The smoky, world-weary voice that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold secrets. She was often the tough girl of the silver screen, the resilient survivor who could trade sharp dialogue with heavyweights like Humphrey Bogart, and never, ever flinch. But her true rebellion, her ultimate act of defiance, went far beyond the tragic characters she portrayed. When the camera stopped rolling, Ida did something almost unthinkable for a woman navigating the treacherous waters of the 1950s studio system. She stepped behind the camera. She became a director. A lonely pioneer in a fiercely patriarchal world, demanding respect and getting it. In boardrooms full of powerful men in tailored suits who mistakenly thought they owned her very soul. We are dedicated to preserving the true stories of the Golden Era. Your subscription is what keeps these legends alive. But beneath that heavy armor, beneath the impenetrable facade of the trailblazing filmmaker and the hardened star of suspense, beat a heart that was intensely, almost dangerously, vulnerable. The press saw the Iron Lady of Hollywood. The studio executives saw a relentless, brilliant negotiator. But very, very few saw the fragile woman who, in the quiet, lonely moments away from the blinding Klieg lights, desperately longed for a true anchor in the stormy seas of show business. Decades later, before she passed, in a quiet, deeply reflective moment that stripped away all the carefully constructed layers of Hollywood myth-making, Ida Lupino made a final, heartbreaking confession. She admitted that despite the fierce battles, the monumental triumphs, and the deep, invisible scars left by a lifetime in the unforgiving public eye, there was one man, one single, intensely turbulent force of nature, who was, without a shadow of a doubt, the absolute love of her life. This is not just another sanitized story about Hollywood royalty. This is a careful autopsy of a profound, overwhelmingly complex romance. A love story that the studio fixers desperately tried to control, and the tabloids ruthlessly tried to tear apart. To truly understand the incredible depth of this passion and the tragic inevitability of its breaking point, we must first examine the heavy chains Ida had to shatter, just to survive in a town that was terrified of independent women. She was a visionary who built her own creative empire, yet she willingly surrendered her guarded heart to a captivating co-star who was quietly battling his own heavy, inescapable demons. To truly comprehend the woman Howard Duff would eventually call his own, we must first look at the incredible battles she fought to become her own master. In the Golden Age, signing a contract with a major studio like Warner Brothers was supposed to be a golden ticket, but for a fiercely intelligent artist like Ida, it often felt more like an elegant prison sentence. Jack Warner, the formidable head of the studio, had a very specific formula for his female stars. They were to look beautiful, read their lines, and, above all, remain compliant. But compliance was simply not in Ida Lupino's vocabulary. When the studio bosses handed her scripts that she found utterly lacking in substance, roles that reduced women to mere decorative shadows in the background of leading men, she did the unthinkable. She refused them. She would sit out her suspensions without pay, pacing the floors of her home, her mind racing with stories of her own. She was notoriously suspended so often by Jack Warner that it became a running joke in the industry. But behind the laughter, a brilliant, calculating mind was quietly making a plan. Her personal life during these formative years was just as strategic and equally tumultuous. Her first marriage to the actor Louis Hayward, though filled with initial passion, ultimately succumbed to the immense pressures of their dual careers and his own private struggles after returning from the war. It was a painful, defining chapter that taught her a harsh lesson about the fragility of Hollywood romance. But it was her second marriage, to the brilliant writer and producer Collier Young, that fundamentally changed the trajectory of her life. While the romantic spark eventually faded, what replaced it was something far more dangerous to the studio system, a true meeting of minds. Recognizing that the golden handcuffs of Warner Brothers were slowly suffocating her artistic spirit, Ida and Collier made a daring, unprecedented move. They divorced amicably, and then, astonishingly, went into business together. They formed an independent production company called The Filmmakers. It was a revolutionary concept. A female star stepping out of the spotlight to produce and direct gritty, low-budget pictures that tackled social issues the major studios were terrified to touch. She became a towering figure of independence, a woman who looked the most powerful men in Hollywood directly in the eye and quietly built her own empire. She was strong, she was untouchable, or so everyone believed, because just as she was cementing her legacy as the iron-willed pioneer of independent cinema, fate introduced her to a man whose intense charm and brooding shadows would finally pierce through her impenetrable armor. A man who was about to turn her carefully controlled world completely upside down. It was the early 1950s. The golden age of radio was slowly giving way to television, and the cinematic landscape was darkening, reflecting a post-war anxiety that audiences couldn't quite shake. Enter Howard Duff. He was not your standard clean-cut Hollywood leading man. He possessed a rugged, almost cynical charm, a voice that had famously brought the hard-boiled detective Sam Spade to life on the radio airways, a voice that sounded like smooth whiskey poured over crushed ice. He was a man who belonged in the shadows of a noir film, armed with a sharp comeback and a heavy, brooding presence. When Ida Lupino and Howard Duff crossed paths, the attraction was not merely physical. It was a collision of two remarkably intense artistic forces. They were, in many ways, mirror images of each other, both fiercely independent, both exceptionally talented, and both carrying a profound, unspoken understanding of the darker, more complicated sides of human nature. The press, always hungry for a new narrative, quickly branded them the golden couple of suspense. But this was no manufactured, studio-sanctioned romance. This was raw, authentic, and undeniably magnetic. They shared the screen in several pictures, most notably in the gritty, uncompromising thriller, Women's Prison. And later, they would famously co-star in the groundbreaking television series, Mr. Adams and Eve. Watching them perform together was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance on the edge of a cliff. The chemistry was palpable. It crackled through the celluloid, the sharp banter, the lingering glances, the subtle shifts in power dynamics. It wasn't acting, not entirely. What the audiences were witnessing was the real-life passion of a deeply connected couple, bleeding effortlessly into their professional art. For Ida, a woman who had fought so bitterly to maintain her absolute control in a male-dominated industry, surrendering to this relationship was a monumental leap of faith. Howard was her creative equal, a partner who respected her brilliant, uncompromising vision. He didn't see the tough, demanding director that the studio executives feared. He saw the brilliant, vulnerable woman who desperately needed someone strong enough to share the heavy burden of her extraordinary ambitions. They married in 1951, a union that felt destined, powerful, and creatively explosive. They built a life together, welcoming a daughter, Bridget, and navigating the treacherous, ever-shifting sands of the entertainment industry as a united, formidable front. To the outside world, they had achieved the impossible dream, a successful, passionate marriage in a town famous for destroying them. But as the decade wore on, and the pressures of maintaining their respective careers began to mount, the very intensity that had drawn them together slowly began to fuel a darker, much more complicated dynamic behind closed doors. The shadows of the noir films they so brilliantly inhabited were quietly beginning to creep into their reality. The 1950s were an era of profound, relentless transition for Hollywood. And behind the closed doors of their seemingly perfect sun-drenched California home, Ida Lupino and Howard Duff were feeling the violent tremors of that seismic shift, while they presented a united, impossibly glamorous front to the eager flashbulbs of the press. The reality of their daily lives was slowly becoming a delicate, exhausting balancing act. Ida, ever the restless, visionary force of nature, was leaning heavier and heavier into her unprecedented role as a pioneering director. As the major film studios began to lose their iron grip on the American public, television was rapidly taking over, and Ida Tatsda adapted brilliantly. She began breaking glass ceilings in television, directing complex, intense episodes for prestigious, heavily masculine shows like The Untouchables, The Twilight Zone, and The Fugitive. It was a grueling, high-pressure environment where she had to constantly, repeatedly prove her absolute worth in rooms filled entirely with men who still doubted a woman's capability to call the shots. She was thriving, she was powerful, but the emotional and physical toll it took on her energy was immense. Howard, on the other hand, found himself navigating a much more perilous and deeply frustrating path. The rugged, cynical, hard-boiled detectives he played so flawlessly were slowly falling out of fashion as the industry evolved. The golden age of radio was now just a fading, nostalgic memory, and the harsh transition to the new era of entertainment was not entirely kind to him. This professional stagnation began to quietly, slowly, feed his darker inclinations. He was a deeply talented, profoundly sensitive man, but he battled personal struggles that the studio fixers worked relentlessly to keep out of the morning tabloids. In an industry where crushing pressure was the only constant, Howard increasingly sought refuge in ways that only deepened the silent, aching chasm between him and his wife. The unpredictable moods, the late nights, the reliance on heavy prescriptions that were all too common for stars desperately trying to maintain the brutal pace of the Hollywood machine, it all began to cast a long, suffocating shadow over their marriage. Tell us in the comments, from which city or neighborhood theater do you keep your fondest memories of Saturday matinees? Ida, possessing a fiercely protective and deeply loyal nature, tried desperately to manage the fallout. She became the one desperately holding the fragile, jagged pieces of their life together. She shielded their young daughter from the worst of the emotional storms, and she quietly covered for Howard when the studio executives started asking uncomfortable, probing questions. She loved him. She loved him with a terrifying, all-consuming depth that often defied pure logic. She saw the brilliant, tender, fiercely intelligent man buried beneath the rough, turbulent exterior. But loving a man who is actively at war with his own shadows is a battle that even the strongest, most resilient woman cannot fight forever. The arguments behind closed doors grew more frequent. The heavy, lingering silences between them grew colder, and that beautiful, crackling chemistry that had once illuminated the silver screen slowly began to curdle into a quiet, simmering exhaustion. They were two enormous, fiery personalities, trapped together in a relentless pressure cooker of fame, artistic ambition, and unspoken resentments. The very same passionate qualities that had made them an explosive, magnetic creative partnership were the exact same qualities that were now tearing them apart. The golden couple of suspense was slowly, painfully, beginning to unravel. The 1970s brought a restless, undeniable revolution to the film industry. But for Ida Lupino and Howard Duff, the changing times brought a much more personal, deeply agonizing realization. They were forced to finally accept that love, no matter how fierce, no matter how profoundly rooted in mutual respect, is not always enough to sustain a life together. By 1973, the immense, unbearable weight of their colliding worlds, the intense career pressures, the fading glory of the studio era, and Howard's escalating personal struggles finally fractured the foundation of their legendary union. They separated. After 22 years of marriage, a veritable eternity in the shallow, fleeting world of show business, the golden couple quietly stepped away from each other. Now, in a town where public scandals were traded like currency, the tabloids were practically salivating. The new era of entertainment journalism was ruthless, and they were eager to tear down the established legends of the old studio system. They wanted a messy, tragic Hollywood divorce. They wanted to expose Howard's heavy prescriptions and his battles with the shadows. But they had profoundly underestimated Ida Lupino. Even in the midst of her own profound heartbreak, Ida remained the brilliant, fiercely protective director of her own life's narrative. She absolutely refused to throw the man she loved to the wolves of the press. There were no explosive, tearful interviews, no bitter accusations plastered across the morning papers. With the same iron will she had used to force Jack Warner into submission decades earlier, she constructed an impenetrable wall of silence and dignity around their separation. She shielded Howard's vulnerable reputation with everything she had, ensuring that the public remembered him as the talented, rugged star he was, and not as a casualty of the Hollywood machine. It was a stunning display of grace. And it spoke volumes about the unbreakable, foundational bond they shared. In fact, they could not even bring themselves to finalize the divorce for over a decade. It wasn't until 1984, 11 long years after their initial separation, that the legal papers were finally, reluctantly signed. It was the longest, most painful goodbye, a testament to two people who simply could not figure out how to live together, but were absolutely terrified of existing in a world where they were completely apart. They remained deeply, irrevocably connected. They would still speak. They still shared a daughter, Bridget, and a lifetime of monumental shared history that no legal document could ever erase. The separation was not an end to their love. It was merely a desperate, necessary ceasefire in a war of two overwhelming personalities. But as the 1980s dawned and the twilight years began to settle over these two titans of the golden age, a quiet, devastating final chapter was waiting to be written. The twilight years of the golden era stars are often painted with a brush of quiet tragedy, but Ida Lupino was never one to fit into a predictable narrative. As the 1980s progressed, and her physical health began to slowly decline, she retreated from the intense, endlessly demanding world of Hollywood production. She lived quietly in her California home, but her mind remained as fiercely sharp and as brilliantly analytical as the days when she was relentlessly negotiating with the studio executives. Howard Duff, meanwhile, continued to act in television, carrying that same rugged, world-weary charm into his later roles. But the dark shadows he had battled for so long, the heavy toll of an unforgiving industry, eventually caught up with him. In 1990, Howard passed away. For Ida, the loss was absolute. It was a profound, silent grief that she carried entirely away from the prying eyes of the relentless press. Despite the bitter arguments, despite the agonizing 11-year separation, and despite the finality of their legal divorce, her deep, fundamental connection to him had never truly been severed. The golden couple of suspense had been broken by the brutal machinery of fame and the inescapable weight of human frailty. But the powerful, underlying foundation of their love had miraculously survived the wreckage. In the quiet solitude of her final years, before she peacefully passed away in 1995, Ida became deeply reflective. The Iron Lady of Film Noir, the fearless, trailblazing director who had kicked down the heavy, masculine doors of the studio system, allowed herself a rare moment of pure, unguarded honesty. To those closest to her, stripping away all the carefully curated mythology of Hollywood, she made a quiet, definitive confession. She admitted that through all the magnificent triumphs, all the shattered glass ceilings, and all the profound heartbreaks, Howard Duff, the intensely complicated man who matched her fiery spirit, was the absolute love of her life. It is a remarkably poignant, powerful realization. It reminds us that behind the immaculate, strictly controlled illusions of the Golden Age were real, deeply vulnerable people. People who loved furiously, who made devastating mistakes, and who carried the beautiful, heavy scars of their passions until the very end. Ida Lupino left behind a monumental, unprecedented legacy of independence and brilliant artistic vision. She proved to the world that a woman could master the complex, ruthless machinery of Hollywood. But perhaps her most relatable, most enduringly human legacy is the proof that some loves, no matter how profoundly turbulent, simply refuse to fade to black.